Hello, I'm Steve Buck, Chair of the Department of Psychology here at the University of Washington. The lecture you're about to see is part of our annual Alan Edwards Psychology Lecture Series. Professor Edwards was affiliated with the Department of Psychology for half a century until his death in 1994. He was an outstanding teacher, researcher, and writer who introduced new statistical techniques that are credited with changing the way modern psychological research is conducted. Alan also permanently enhanced the intellectual climate of UW Psychology by endowing the Alan Edwards Lectureship, which since 1999 has brought an impressive list of renowned psychologists to the UW campus to interact with faculty and students. Now, the annual Alan Edwards Psychology Lecture Series presents the excitement of psychological research and its tangible benefits to both local and national audiences. The lecture you're about to watch is one of a pair given back-to-back that matched a UW Psychology faculty member with a visiting researcher to talk about a topic of great public and scientific interest.
So good evening, everybody, and I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight to share your evening with us. Just to introduce myself, I'm Sheri Mizumori, the current chair of the psychology department here at the University of Washington. And I have the distinct honor of welcoming you to the 4th annual Alan L. Edwards Public Lecture Series. Tonight's lecture comprises the 3rd and final installment, you might say, of 3 sets of lectures that we have been presenting over the last few weeks. Tonight we'll feature Dr. Lee Osterhout from our department here in psychology and his colleague Karen Emery from San Diego State University. They will present some fascinating new work on brain mechanisms of language in hearing in deaf and hearing people, as well as how such language abilities endows individuals with seemingly infinite capabilities to communicate with each other. Now first I'd like to introduce Lee Osterhout. He received his PhD in experimental psychology from Tufts University in 1990. He went on to do postdoctoral work in psychology at Northwestern University and then came to the University of Washington as an assistant professor in 1991. He has been a visiting scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands and also the Max Planck Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience in Germany. He has kind of come through the ranks, you might say, in our department, being promoted to associate professor and more recently to full professor in 2007. He is also a research affiliate from the Blodell Hearings Research Center here at the University of Washington. Now, Dr. Osterhout's work on the neurocognition of language comprehension has long-standing support from the National Institutes of Health, and in particular the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communications Disorders. He is co-director of the interdisciplinary research grants on communications disorders, and he is involved in NIH-sponsored graduate training grants in the speech and hearing sciences. Dr. Osterhout images the brain in a variety of ways that I'm sure you'll hear about tonight to understand how the brain mediates native language functions relative to second languages. His findings are published in the best journals in psychology and in neurolinguistics. Now, clearly, Dr. Osterhout is a leader in his field, as evidenced by the fact that he's consistently asked to speak at a variety of meetings and speaking engagements around the world. He has served on NIH grant review panels, and he has held a number of prestigious editorial posts. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Osterhout tonight.
Thanks, Sheri. So what's so special about human language? After all, we're one of many species that uses sound to communicate. So for example, we have the white-crowned sparrow, birds I find their song particularly attractive, vervet monkeys, and human beings. So we all use sound to communicate meanings to other members of our species. So how are we special? Well, here's one profound way that we are special and different from the other vocal communicators. How many meanings can a white-crowned sparrow transmit to another white-crowned sparrow? You already know the answer. 2. So basically they can say, hey, get off my nest area. And they can say, you're a mighty attractive looking white-crowned sparrow bird. So you basically have 2 meanings, territory, territorial defense, and mating. Now, the vervet monkey is a bit more expressive, so I'm no expert on vervet monkeys. I don't pretend to be, but they tell me that they can communicate about 30 meanings to other vervet monkeys. What about us? How many meanings can we communicate to our conspecifics? Well, the truly amazing thing about humans is that we can transmit an essentially limitless set of meanings to other people. We don't know what the limits are, if there are any. And this amazing capacity is one thing that makes humans truly unique. And in fact, most of the behaviors that we think of as uniquely human or distinctively human, they rely in some way, one way or another, upon human language. For example, look at what we're doing right now. Fundamentally linked to our ability to communicate meanings in such a rich way. But of course, we learn to use language at an early age, and it's like second nature. So we take it for granted. We forget in our daily lives how fundamentally important this skill is to our culture, to our existence, until that skill is taken away from us. And unfortunately, that can happen, and does happen. Aphasia is the term we use to refer to people who've suffered some sort of brain damage, brain insult, and they lose the ability to speak or understand speech, some kind of speech disorder. It's an acquired deficit because it happens as a result of damage. So here's a damaged brain. In fact, this is probably one of the most famous brains in history. It belongs to a Frenchman named Le Borgne. Le Borgne was unfortunate enough to catch syphilis. And the disease spread to his brain and resulted in some neuron death. And of course, the result of that was a hole in his brain. Le Borgne had a hole in his brain in the frontal lobe of his left hemisphere. Now, before the injury, like most of us, all of us who are neurologically intact, and his speech was very fluent and meaningful and grammatical before the insult, but afterwards it was like this, slow, effortful speech. It's as though each word is just so difficult to get out of your mouth. It was ungrammatical, so it was missing a lot of the words that we use as sort of the grammatical window, the grammatical aspects of language. They were mostly missing, just nouns and verbs. But even though there were these serious abnormalities, the meaning was still intact. So you could still understand what Le Borgne meant when he spoke. It simply wasn't fluent and grammatical. He could also still understand speech pretty well. In fact, he volunteered to help around the hospital ward, and he did so very well. Le Borgne's physician was this truly remarkable man, Paul Broca. Broca studied Le Borgne and performed the autopsy after he died. He actually died from gangrene. He's not a lucky man. And what he discovered was two things, two basic discoveries that were very important for the science. First, he discovered that when he looked at his patients that he was accumulating, he noticed that damage to exactly the same spot in the right hemisphere didn't produce an aphasia, whereas damage to this spot in the frontal lobe in the left hemisphere often, but not always, did. So he deduced that there must be these hemispheric differences in what functions they support, and language must be in the left. The other thing he deduced was, well, it must be, at least in some cases, that some kinds of functions can be localized to specific parts of the brain. So not just a hemisphere, but part of the hemisphere. And so this localizationist position was one that was based on these 20 or 25 patients that he studied at autopsy. Those are two major contributions to the field. And in Broca's honor, this place in the left hemisphere has become known as Broca's area. And this syndrome of speech deficits and speech capabilities has become known as Broca's aphasia. It's not at all uncommon to see Broca's aphasic patients in clinical neuropsychology settings. I'm going to show you a videotape of this is a textbook case of a Broca's aphasic. So notice what is wrong and what's right with this person's speech.
Now tell me what this thing was with your legs last week or week before.
No good. Ache And
So clearly he understood the question and tried to answer, and his answer was meaningful. It was appropriate for the question. But he was having a tremendous amount of difficulty producing the few words that he could. Here's another damaged brain. But now the damage is not in the front of the brain, in the left hemisphere. It's toward the back. It's located in the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, a fairly large lesion. And this kind of damage will also produce a speech disorder, an aphasia, but it's nothing like Broca's aphasia. It's almost a mirror image of Broca's aphasia. So what you often see, not always, but you often see with damage toward the back of the left hemisphere is a syndrome like this. Fluent speech, even hyperfluent, more fluent than normal. The speech can be perfectly grammatical, but it often has very odd meanings that the person is communicating. So here we see fluent grammatical speech, but bizarre meanings, the flip of Broca's aphasia. And their speech comprehension can be extraordinarily poor. It's as if their answers bear no resemblance to what you ask them. And this kind of aphasic disorder was named after the German researcher Karl Wernicke. And so we refer to this as Wernicke's area and Wernicke's aphasia. So let's take a look and contrast this patient with the one that we just saw a minute ago. It's dramatically different.
barefoot, boom.
What's this?
The big end right there, end of the football.
End of the football?
It influenced the football right here. The cause that it comes in, see?
Yeah.
The end of it, see? Yeah. Oh, we have other things, see?
I don't understand.
Yeah, it's very hard to understand what he was saying. Now, that person appears to be perhaps having a problem with psychosis, but in fact, in this case, that's not true. What's disordered is his language abilities. So how can we take these examples of language dysfunction and map them onto the brain to say something meaningful about the relationship between language and brain? The first attempt to do that was by people like Broca and Wernicke and their colleagues. And the idea was, well, maybe Broca's area is really important for producing speech sounds. So if you damage it, you become non-fluent and speech becomes really hard to do. And maybe back here in Wernicke's area, that's really important for comprehending speech sounds, so in perceiving and comprehending the speech. So if you have damage there, you won't be able to understand what people are asking you, and you won't even understand your own speech to know that what you're saying makes no sense. So that's one model that became popular for a while. And it does make sense given certain, it makes more sense given certain facts. For example, the motor cortex is the part of your brain that controls voluntary muscle movement. So if I move my arm, what's happening is my motor cortex in my right hemisphere is sending a signal to move my left arm. And furthermore, there's what's called a somatotopic organization, where the body parts are laid out right on the motor strip. And it turns out that the neurons that control leg movements, they're up there, and the neurons that control arm movements are down here. Guess where the neurons that control face movements might be? Right next to Broca's area. So that makes a lot of sense then to hypothesize that Broca's aphasia is probably primarily a problem in controlling the muscles that you need to speak. Similarly, if you look at where the auditory cortex is, the auditory cortex is the part of the brain that processes sound, any kind of sound. It happens to be really close to the classic Wernicke's area. So it makes sense that you would say, well, maybe it's a problem at some level of sound perception, not sound in general, but the kinds of sounds that we use to communicate our meanings. That seems reasonable. But there are some facts that make that idea a little bit problematic. For example, if Broca's aphasia really, and Wernicke's aphasia really reflect problems in processing sound, then you might expect their writing to be perfectly normal. I mean, when you write, you use your hands to write. You don't use your face. At least I don't do that. And when you are reading, you use your eyes and not your ears. So if it's true, if what I have just suggested is truly true, then you might think that their writing would be relatively unimpaired. Here's a rather amazing fact. their writing is almost exactly like their speech. So here's a sample of writing from a Broca's aphasic. Remember, that's the non-fluent but meaningful speech person. And the patient was asked to describe this scene. This is from the Boston Diagnostic aphasic exam. And what you see in that picture is that's probably the mother drying dishes. There's an interesting water cascading there from the sink. But in the back, there's two kids, maybe the daughter and the brother. And the brother is standing on a stool, and that's tipping over. That's not good. He's got his hand in the cookie jar. So when a Broca's aphasic was asked to describe the scene by writing about it, here's what the Broca's aphasic wrote. That's not a grammatical sentence. Boy, spill cookies. And furthermore, when they were writing, it was extremely hard for them to write. Very slow and labored, just like their speech. So not only do they produce non-fluent but meaningful speech, they also produce non-fluent but meaningful writing. And so if it's all about sound, this is a bit puzzling. What about the Wernicke's aphasics? Well, here's what the Wernicke's aphasic wrote. Remember, these are the folks who speak fluently but nonsensically. Two children are taking a cucket. One is about to fall. Mother has her back turned while cleaning a pout, and her things are falling on the fall. I think that's what it is. She has curtains on the wall. So there's islands of meaning there, right? And vast vistas of nonsense. So in other words, this Wernicke's aphasic is fluent but nonsensical when writing as well as when speaking. So that does suggest that maybe there's something more central to this disorder that involves not just speech. And without a doubt, there is some kind of motoric element in Broca's aphasic. There is. But maybe there is something that is not just sound, not just speech, but in fact has to do with language. And speech and language are not exactly synonymous. But what might that thing be? If we're going to say that's not quite right, what can we replace those labels with that might account better for the facts? It might be useful at this point, in order to get some ideas about that, to contrast how we speak, how humans speak, with how primates communicate. This will just be an excursion that'll take a couple minutes. But the end result will be, I think, a central key point of what I have to say today. There's two more vervet monkeys. And now if the vervet monkey on the left wants to communicate a meaning to the vervet on the right, the first vervet will in fact vocalize. And specifically, if the vervet monkey on the left happens to see this, that's an eagle. Not a good thing to see, because eagles are a major predator of vervet monkeys. So this vervet monkey will absolutely make the eagle alarm call. And I hope this works. I'll try to play you a little bit of an eagle alarm call. Now, if another vervet monkey hears that, you better believe they're going to do exactly this. They're going to dive under a bush right away. No dallying. Because that's how you survive an eagle attack, is to get the heck out of there and get under something. Now, if instead the vervet monkey had seen a leopard, they would have to communicate that meaning, because obviously leopards, nasty things if you're a vervet monkey. And so the first vervet monkey that sees this will make this sound. Very different. And that means you better get up a tree fast. And believe me, I've seen tapes of this, of the vervet monkeys. You play these sounds. You can play audio recordings. They'll react the same way. It doesn't have to be a real vervet monkey. They are fast getting up that tree, let me tell you. And as I said before, vervets speak about they can produce 30 sounds to communicate, roughly. And here's the thing. Each sound is tied, directly associated with a particular meaning. So 30 sounds map directly onto 30 meanings. What you never see vervet monkeys do is they never combine these sounds to make more complex meanings. I've never seen all the vervet monkeys in the history of the world. However, I think I can safely say that no vervet monkey has ever said, watch out for that leopard and check out the bananas over there on that tree. Because they don't do that. They can't do that. What about human language? In one respect, it seems very similar to what the vervet monkeys do. We start out with a collection of 45 sounds, and if we're English speakers. Some languages, they might have as few as 20. There are a few languages where you might have 120. But roughly 30 or 40 sounds is what we start with, just like the vervet monkey. But how we use these sounds is profoundly different from how a vervet monkey does. We do not map each sound onto a specific meaning. In human language, the sounds have no meaning. What we do instead is we combine these sounds to form larger units of language. So we combine the sounds to make up words, like that. And then we combine the words to make up sentences, like that. So we start out with 45 sounds. We combine them to form maybe 80,000 words, large but finite number. And we combine the words to create, if you believe Noam Chomsky, the famous MIT linguist, a potentially infinite set of well-formed sentences, a bit of magic. And then we map those sentences onto an incredible array of possible meanings. So we are a species that can communicate with our conspecifics in amazing and incredible ways. And that is unique. What's also unique is that the reason we can do that is because we have this layer of grammatical structure between the sounds and the meanings. There are rules for how you put the units together. And so a sentence has both a grammatical structure and it has a meaning. And again, that is fairly unique as far as we know. Here's another amazing thing. When you speak, well, let me put it this way. We don't memorize, 50,000 sentences. And then when just the right moment appears, we pull out that one we want and then regurgitate it. We don't do that. What we do is we build the structure that will convey the meaning in real time as we're speaking. So human language is the quintessential creative process. And of course, that can help us explain an interesting phenomenon. Do you remember the Jan and Dean singing duo, California, early 1960s? They were the Beach Boys before the Beach Boys. California Sound. Well, I believe Jan is the one over here. I'm not exactly positive, but I believe so. And Jan, in 1966, I believe, was in a pretty horrific automobile accident. Guess what part of his brain was damaged? The frontal lobe in his left hemisphere. He became profoundly aphasic, even more so than the patient that we saw in the video. But guess what? After he was released from the hospital, Jan and Dean went back on tour. And for the next 20 years, until Jan died, they toured the United States more or less constantly. And his singing was perfectly fluent. How is it possible that his singing could be perfectly fluent? He sounded just like his records, whereas his speech was completely non-fluent. How is that possible? Same muscles? If it's really a motoric thing, he shouldn't be able to do that. The answer, I think, lies in the fact that human language is a creative act. Memorizing the songs that you learned when you were younger before the accident is an act of memorization. And even though they both use the same system, in a sense, to produce the sounds, damage to Broca's area damaged the creative part of it, not the act of memorization. Now, because it's a creative process, things can go wrong, right? The more creative you are, the more likely you are to make mistakes. So speech errors are something we all make, right? But some people are better at it than others. So rarely is this question asked, is our children learning? Let's see, that would be President-elect George W. Bush. But the point I want to make here is that you've messed up the grammar, George, but you left the meaning clear. So you can disrupt one, but keep the other one perfectly intact. I like this one even more, personally. I believe we are on an irreversible course toward more freedom and democracy. But that could change. That always cracks me up. And of course, this was the estimable Vice President Dan Quayle. There we have a grammatical sentence, but rather odd meaning. It's not really fair to pick on the politicians because we all make speech errors. It's just they do it in front of microphones. It does illustrate, however, first, the creative process. Errors happen. And maybe I should add that errors that involve the grammar tend to be independent of errors that involve meaning, so they can happen independently, and they seem to be fairly segregated. That tells you something about how we do it. You plan them separately. But there's something else that I wanted to bring up here. And that is, this basic distinction between meaning and grammar can also be seen in the damage to the aphasic patients that we talked about earlier. So damage to Broca's area, just to refresh your memory, basically the speech is ungrammatical, but meaningful, mostly. So by contrast, damage to Wernicke's area, you have grammatical speech, but bizarre meanings. So, grammatical but not meaningful. So perhaps, this is just a hypothesis, this fact is relevant to how the brain does language. Maybe something like this is true. Instead of having speech production and speech comprehension, we have grammatical structure and linguistic meaning, representing the essence of human language, not something peripheral. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that's possible. How would we test this to find out? Well, relying on brain damaged patients to tell us is a bit tricky because it's messy. Fortunately, no one intentionally damaged part of their brain in an experiment. It was an act of nature. So there are lots of problems in trying to interpret brain damage as it relates to normal function. A better thing is to try to, a better approach perhaps is to try to use people with normal brains, healthy young people, and see if we can find out what the brain is doing by looking at them. So this is a healthy, normal brain person, and we have placed an electrode cap on top of her head. Now you're probably not aware of this, although you might be, but as you're sitting there, your brain is generating electrical fields. And in fact, some of those are emanating out of your head and into the air above you. That's happening to all of us. So when I put my electrode cap on top of someone's head, I'm measuring those electrical fields that the brain is generating. Just so you know, I never, ever, ever reverse the current and send electrical activity into their brain. Although I could. The technique that we use, that I use mostly, is called an event-related brain potential method. And here's a quick 30-second primer on how we do it. You don't need to know much. So we've got our subject that's wired up there, so with the blue cap on. We're looking at the back of her head. And she's looking at that gigantic screen. This is not drawn to scale. A gigantic screen there. And she's going to be reading a sentence. So you might see a sentence like this. All right, so see a sentence. And let's say that I'm interested in the brain response to the word eat. Well, I can actually look at that by not presenting one sentence, but a whole bunch of sentences like that, each with a word of interest. And I average all those things together, and I get an event-related potential. And if I've done this right, the event-related potential is the brain response that's specific to processing that stimulus of interest. That's the method. That wasn't even 30 seconds. How would we use the method? Oh, I should mention before I go on, don't ask why. But voltage here, negative, is plotted up. I don't know why. I do know why, but you don't want to know. And so negative is plotted up, positive is plotted down, and time is on the other axis, and that's about a little over 1 second of time. And the great thing about event-related potentials is we have what's called a temporal resolution in the milliseconds, really fast. That's not true of most other brain imaging methods. And we can use that to our advantage, as we will. How would we use this method to learn something about language and brain? Well, we ask people to read sentences like this. The cat will eat the food I leave on the porch. My cats certainly do that. They don't do this, though. The cat will bake the food I leave on the porch. Now, that does happen in cartoon worlds. And in fact, just so you know, if you ask someone to imagine when they're reading this that it's a cartoon, what I'm about to tell you may not happen. Let's keep that in mind. Now, what kind of brain response are we going to see to that odd meaning word, the word bake? Let's find out. I'm going to show you the brain response, the ERPs, recorded from the top of the head, right here, to the word eat and the word bake at the same time. And your task is to remember this. The black solid line is the response to eat, which is okay. And the dashed line is the response to bake, which is kind of weird. And what do you know? Your brain knows the difference. So right about 400 milliseconds, about half a second, not quite half a second, after they see these words, you see this negative deflection and the response to the odd meaning word. Which direction is pointing up here? Negative, right. So it's a negative wave that peaks at 400 milliseconds, hence the name N400. This is one of the most robust findings in science you could possibly imagine. I have literally tested thousands of people, and very, very rarely do I find someone who doesn't produce this response. Now, here's an interesting question you could ask. We've got the same first sentence. What about this one? The cat will eat the food I leave on the porch. Now, the word eat is perfectly appropriate in terms of its meaning, but it's in the wrong grammatical form. Now, if your brain really distinguishes between the meaning and the structure of a sentence, maybe we'll see a different brain response. And by golly, that's exactly what happens. So instead of seeing, an N400, they both elicit N400 components, but there's no amplitude difference. Instead, you see this gigantic positive wave that happens a little bit after that. This is another one of those scientific facts that are incredibly easy to reproduce. Again, out of the thousands of people we tested, very rarely do we find one who doesn't show this. So the brain seems to be distinguishing between the meaning of a sentence and its grammatical structure. Not only that, as an aside, if you put them together in a word sentence like, the cat will bake the food, that's wrong in both ways. What you get approximates the linear summation of the two responses in isolation. All right, so we have these two brain responses. We have one that's sensitive to meaning, and it has a temporal course. Remember I told you we take advantage of time, the temporal resolution of our method? And we know that between, 300 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds, at least as far as we can tell, the brain is really sensitive to the meaning of that sentence. And between 500 milliseconds and, maybe 800 milliseconds, the brain is really sensitive to the grammatical structure of the sentence. Now, here's what we can do. We're going to take it back to the brain. We can apply statistical methods for estimating where in the brain the signals are coming from. Not with certainty, there's uncertainty there. But they do exist, and we've done that. But we're not going to do this on the weird sentences. We're going to do it on the perfectly okay sentences. And we're going to look at the time window when the brain is sensitive to meaning, and the time window when the brain is sensitive to the grammatical structure. And what we find is this. Now that is pretty close to Wernicke's area, certainly within the area that you see Wernicke symptoms if it's damaged. What about the grammar-sensitive window? Dead on in Broca's area. So there's nothing anomalous with these sentences. They're perfectly okay. But one way to interpret this, again, I'm not saying this is true, but one way to interpret this is to say, well, golly, maybe you have a part of the brain that sort of relates sounds and graphemes to meanings, or at least plays some role in that function, and that's toward the back of the brain somewhere. And you have another part of your brain that helps you understand the grammatical structure a little bit and relate one word to sequence that's appropriate for a sentence, and that's in the front of your brain, near Broca's area. And that's a possibility. So, it's a model like that. But now consider this. I'm always telling you something I shouldn't tell you. Watch this video, please. And I want you to tell me what kind of brain response you would see to the obvious thing that happens in here. There's no sound, it's just video. What do you think? Is that an error of meaning or of grammar? Maybe a little bit of both. But in fact, you do see a really pretty robust N400 response, the meaning error response. That's very similar to the one we see to language. There's no language there, though. No sound. OK, now listen to this. This will be familiar to you, I'm sure, up to a point. Ouch. What kind of brain response do you think we observe to that? Well, in fact, it's a brain response that's pretty similar to the ungrammatical sentence, a sequence that doesn't work. So, again, I'm not saying that what I'm about to tell you is true. But it's possible that something like this is wrong. And what we have here are areas of the brain that are essential for language, but not only language. And that language takes advantage of them. But that they're not just for language. I think that's kind of how the brain works in general. Clearly, though, we don't know, especially based on what I told you in this 40 minutes, there's a lot we don't know about language in the brain. But since Paul Broca's time, we've come a long way down the path toward understanding. And personally, I'm really looking forward to seeing what's around the next bend. Thank you very much.
I was just interested if you'd studied young people, especially who maybe don't speak with correct English grammar, when they make up their own rules, like him and me are going to go to the store, and do they recognize a sentence like that as being ungrammatical, or do they hear somebody that says that he and I are going to go to the store and they think that's wrong?
That's a great question. And I have my own child, but even before that, I knew I never wanted to work with children. It's really hard to do this kind of study, but that's a great question. You know, I am not a language acquisition expert, but I do know, for personal experience partly, watching my child develop language, that a lot of times their productions and their comprehensions don't really match, they're not really in sync. So I remember my own son making a lot of grammatical errors, but if I had said that, he'd said, "Daddy, what did you say?" So in that sense, there's a disconnect, and I'm not sure what I would predict. But I'm sure at some stages in acquisition, that's true. Their productions would mirror how they would perceive things when they're listening. So I would expect their brains to respond differently than mine would. But that's completely unstudied at the moment.
Next question.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is that conceptual knowledge seems to me to be a form of pattern recognition. And the question is, have you done any studies concerning people who stutter? Because this being able to sing without brain problems or without stuttering is a common characteristic of those people.
Yes, stuttering actually has become a very interesting topic of study. And we don't have a perfect understanding of what causes stuttering. And so, yes, you could develop some hypotheses that, you know, again, I'm not saying that what I have on the screen here is correct, but you could develop a hypothesis that perhaps if that part of the brain is involved in sequence processing, especially motoric sequence processing, then it would play some role in stuttering. And I don't know that they really know the answer to that question yet. It's something that people are actively trying to explain, is stuttering disorders and how they relate to the speech centers, if you will.
Why don't we go, I think you're here first.
Yes, I kind of have a question that is two questions, but about the same thing related to the first gentleman. With bilingual students or adults, is there studies that have looked at that? As obviously, different languages have different grammar systems. And then also sign language in deaf people, or even the primates. Has anyone ever studied the difference in the areas of the brain?
Well, the primate study I won't try to answer. The deaf language study I will let Karen answer. But the first one I'm happy to answer. So we've done a lot of work looking at second language learning, and I'm really excited about what we're finding. And it turns out you can ask a lot of interesting questions, the influence of the first language on the second language. The beautiful thing about our method is that we can learn a lot about how quickly they integrate that information into their real-time language comprehension system. That's very different from how you do on a test. You know, you can get an A on a test in a French class and not understand any French. It's entirely possible. So we're interested in how people assimilate that knowledge in a way that allows them to understand it in real time. And it's an interesting story. I don't have time to tell you all of it here. I will say this. If you've been going to French class for a couple of weeks, how much French do you think you know? when we asked our subjects, they said, I don't know any French. I didn't even study. Then we bring them into our lab and we wire them up and we present real French words and pseudo-French words that aren't French words but could be. And we say, all right, push one button if it's a French word and the other button if it's not. And they just laugh about it. How am I supposed to know? Like I said, I didn't study. The amazing thing, even though they're absolutely at chance in making this decision, their brains do it very well. So the moral of the story there is that even though you don't think you've learned anything in French class, your brain has, and that's really what counts.
We have one question over here.
You were talking about patients with damage to the Broca's area and how their speech is ungrammatical. And I was wondering if there was any research indicating whether they actually forget grammatical structure or if they're somewhat choosing to not use it because speech is so difficult to produce. So is it more a grammar problem or more so just the production problem?
Oh, what a fantastic question. It turns out that it's a bit of a murky story because in many respects they do seem to be what they call agrammatic. But then some researchers a number of years ago decided they thought of asking the patients to make explicit grammaticality judgments of sentences. And what do you know? Some of them could do it. So it's not as though they've lost, perhaps, it's not as though they've lost their knowledge of grammar. I'm a little hesitant to commit myself here, but I think that what we're looking at in our experiments is the real-time usage of that knowledge. That's very different from what you can, again, if you take a French test that tests your explicit knowledge, you might get an A, but how you actually process the language would get an F. And I think the same thing could apply here.
Thanks. We'll take this question here.
So it seems like there's a lot of ways that you could use this to look at different things that the brain is doing. What sort of applications have been looked at or developed using this kind of meaning versus structure stuff?
Well, I know some people who are getting CIA money, but I can't tell you about it. That was a joke, actually. Well, we've used it to study language acquisition, and that's the primary way we've used it. But you could certainly, now that it doesn't seem to be necessarily uniquely linguistic, but also extended other domains, it opens up a pretty rich set of questions. So one graduate student is asking questions about pattern processing in general. So we've extended beyond language, quite far from language when you do that.
Okay, one more question on the other side.
I've heard that sometimes you can characterize like the left and right hemispheres of the brain as having like different styles of thinking. Like the right brain is kind of like your big picture thinking, and your left brain is like your more logical thinking. And that kind of looked similar to the ways you broke it up over here. And I was wondering if you ever related it that way.
I'm sure Karen has an excellent answer to that question. Well, actually, I think, actually, there's some truth to that. I mean, obviously, and for most people, language is a left hemisphere thing. And language is all about, as we've seen, structure, I wouldn't say logic, but the right hemisphere, if you have damage to it, you can get, let's say, spatial problems in navigating through space, for example. Also, if you have damage to the right side, you can affect language, but not the kind of language we've been talking about. You affect the prosodic, the ability to perceive or produce prosodic contour. So I don't speak like a monotone. We have up and down, prosodic contour, pitch changes, and damage to some parts of the right hemisphere can take that away. So there was Oliver Sacks has a great story to tell in one of his books about patients. Some of them had left hemisphere damage and some had right. And they were listening to Ronald Reagan give a speech. And the people who had damage to the right hemisphere, they could no longer process the the left hemisphere. People could no longer process the words and their meanings very well. They loved it because of the rich prosodic nature of his speech. But people with damage to the right side, they were insensitive to the prosody, and they said, that guy's an idiot. Not that he was. I'm just reporting Oliver Sacks' story.
Okay, we have one more question on the other side.
Would you speak more to the general topic of language and the brain, which of course is the topic of the talk here, but knowing one language or two or three, what kind of a difference does that make, and how does the brain handle that?
That's a great question. There is a growing literature on that. Where do I start? Well, to be honest with you, most people here probably are monolingual, right? We live in America. But if you move to Europe, most people are multilingual. I do think Europeans in general are a little bit more intelligent than Americans. This is my bias. But in terms of what happens in your brain, there have been reports using functional magnetic resonance imaging, like Karen will talk about, that initially suggested that your brain sort of parcellated it, so you have one, at least in terms of Broca's area, part of it does one language and part of it does the other. Sorry to say that finding's been kind of debunked. We don't really know how you fit two languages in one brain. It's a great mystery. Or 3 or 4. My mother was a professor of Romance languages. She knew like 7. I could struggle barely through French.
Thank you.